Victory always tastes like sweetness. Or at least, it should. That's what Jace Wilder thought, but standing in the middle of the destroyed headquarters of the Omnicorp Tower, he felt nothing. No rush of triumph, no adrenaline-fueled high. Just a deep, lingering sense of confusion. The world's largest corporation, the one that had held the population in an iron grip for decades, was now rubble. And yet, Jace couldn't help but feel as though something was missing. He watched his team of genetically enhanced soldiers, their muscles rippling under their uniforms as they moved with precision, securing the building. A few scattered pockets of resistance were mopped up easily, though they were no match for the finely honed group Jace had led to this moment. The battle, if you could even call it that, was over in a matter of hours. "Nice job, Commander," said Sloane, his second-in-command, her voice flat but efficient. Jace nodded. She was a tall woman, with dark eyes that had once burned with a fierce loyalty. Now, she just looked tired. He felt it too. All of them did. There was no celebration, no jubilation. Only an eerie silence as the last enemy forces crumpled into submission. "Are we done here?" asked Jace, his voice surprisingly hoarse for someone who just won the war. He didn't even feel like he'd earned the victory. Where was the satisfaction of a battle well fought? The satisfaction of knowing they'd finally toppled the oppressors who had kept humanity in shackles for so long, but no. There was none of that. The enemy had fallen apart far too easily. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable had been nothing more than paper. And now, even as the soldiers roamed the halls of Omnicorp Tower, securing the last of the evidence and taking control, there was this deep, gnawing feeling in the pit of Jace's stomach. Something was wrong. "They're surrendering, sir," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see one of his soldiers, a young man with a shaved head and an unreadable expression, standing in the doorway. Jace looked at him, trying to shake off the confusion clouding his mind. "Then let them go," he said. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was just the end of a task, a job well done. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was lost in this easy win. He turned and walked to the edge of the tower's rooftop, watching the broken skyline of the city below. Once a sprawling metropolis of endless traffic and oppressive luxury, now it felt like nothing more than a graveyard of gleaming glass. This had been their fight, hadn't it? To free the people? To end the endless oppression that had stifled creativity, freedom, and even basic human dignity. But what was the point of freedom if you didn't feel anything? Days passed since the victory, and the euphoria of rebellion had worn off like an old coat. The celebratory speeches were made, speeches that rang hollow and devoid of any real emotion. Jace had delivered his own speech, of course. He'd spoken about hope, about the new future they were creating. But when he stepped down from the podium, he couldn't help but notice the emptiness in the crowd. People clapped, of course, it was the right thing to do, but their applause sounded more mechanical than heartfelt. It felt rehearsed. Like a performance, not a genuine reaction. At night, Jace sat in his quarters, staring out of the window at the city. His reflection seemed like a stranger to him, the only thing unchanged in this world that was supposed to be new. The rebels had won, the corporation was no more, but who were they now? The revolution had demanded a sacrifice, the blood of thousands, the pain of many more. But they hadn't talked about what would happen after. No one had ever mentioned the cost of victory, and then there was the strange, creeping feeling that grew each day. Jace didn't care about anything, really. Not the people around him, not the city they had liberated, not even his soldiers. The most disturbing part was how he noticed it in them too. There was a sharp, cold detachment in their eyes. The soldiers who had once fought with ferocity, with passion, now moved like machines, their actions efficient but hollow. "I think we should make contact with the survivors from the outskirts," Sloane suggested one morning, breaking him from his trance. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Jace nodded, but the thought of it left him unmoved. "Sure. Let's set up a meeting. Sloane blinked. You don't care, do you? Jace raised an eyebrow. About what? About anything. About them, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the open city beyond the walls of their compound. Jace didn't know how to respond. Wasn't it supposed to be this way? Wasn't that what they'd trained for? To stay focused, to remove the distractions of emotion, so they could win this war? That's what the science had promised. The more emotion they removed, the more effective they would be. Victory. Freedom. That was all that mattered. Is it just me, or do we all feel wrong? Sloane asked. Jace stared at her for a long moment before answering. I don't know. But I feel it too. Weeks passed. The war was over. The corporation was gone, its resources seized, its leaders exiled or executed. The soldiers and civilians slowly began to rebuild, but with each passing day, the emotionless atmosphere settled deeper into the new society they had created. The citizens had nothing to cling to but the cold logic of efficiency. The same logic that had governed their rebellion now ruled their new world. Jace couldn't help but feel like a failure. Victory had come at a cost he hadn't foreseen. The rebellion, the victory, had been about emotion, about fighting for something bigger than themselves. And yet, here they were, a group of people so consumed by the need to be perfect that they'd lost the very thing that made them human. Jace was left in charge, but what could he lead? An army of the emotionally empty? He had led them to victory, but now, what was the purpose? What did it mean to be free when the freedom felt like a hollow cage? One evening, Jace found himself pacing the length of his quarters, trying to find some semblance of emotion, of connection. He tried to remember what it was like to feel. The passion of the battle, the joy of victory, the anger at the oppression that had driven them all to this moment. But it was all a blur now. The emotions had been bled out of him, as if someone had drained him of color and left only shades of gray. He remembered a time, long before the revolution, when he had known love. There had been a girl. Her name was Cassie. She had been bright, and the world had seemed full of possibility when they were together. He remembered the way her smile had lit up the room, the way her laugh had been like music in his ears. They had been in love, once, but now? Now, he couldn't remember what that had felt like. His memories of her seemed like echoes in a void. Did it matter? Was it worth it? He wasn't even sure anymore. The world they had created was functional. It worked. The economy was running, cities were being rebuilt, systems were being restored. But the price was clear. People walked around like zombies, their eyes empty. Their movements were precise, but there was no spark, no zest for life. It was as if the fire had been put out. Jace had tried to fix it, at first. He'd spoken to his soldiers, asked them how they felt, if they felt anything. But all they did was shrug, their answers always logical, always without feeling. It's for the best, they'd say. We're doing what's right. We've won. That's enough. But was it? Jace sat alone in his quarters late into the night, the lights of the city flickering far below like dead stars. His mind was a whirlpool, every thought pulling him deeper into frustration and confusion. He had led them to victory, had stood at the head of an army of people who had fought for the freedom to feel, to live without fear, and yet, here they were, empty. There were moments when Jace felt like a fraud. What was the point of winning a revolution if the very thing that made them human, emotion, was lost? He thought back to the early days of the war, when the rebels had first gathered together, their spirits ignited by shared anger, by the belief that they could change the world. It had been real, that fire. It had burned in their hearts, and it had driven them through every battle, every sacrifice. But now? Now there was nothing. No fire, no warmth. Just a world of cold calculation. He stood up, pacing back and forth in the quiet room, his boots clicking softly on the floor. His thoughts kept spiraling back to that moment, when everything had changed. When they had won, but in doing so, had lost. Sloane had been right. There was something wrong. A deep, insidious emptiness that permeated everything. The soldiers walked like ghosts, mechanical in their efficiency. They still followed orders, still executed their tasks with precision, but it was as though they were moving through life in autopilot. They were the perfect machines, capable of greatness, but without a soul to drive them. In the corridors outside, Jace could hear the muffled sounds of soldiers going about their duties, silent, methodical. He used to hear laughter, conversation, even arguments that felt real, like the ebb and flow of human life. Now, the only sounds were the hum of machinery, the soft clink of metal, the whispers of things that didn't matter. He stepped into the hall and walked through the empty building, his footsteps echoing off the cold, polished floors. It all felt so sterile. The place that had once been a symbol of rebellion now looked like a high-tech office complex. There were no signs of joy, no celebration. Even the decorations, meant to commemorate the victory, the revolution, were arranged with such sterile precision that they looked almost as if they had been manufactured for a corporate lobby. Jace walked past the old war room, where the maps and battle strategies had once been pinned to the walls, filled with urgent red marks and notes written in haste. Now, the room was empty. There were no papers, no plans, no ongoing war. Just a quiet, untouched space. The silence weighed on him, pressing in from all sides. He found himself in the courtyard of the compound, staring out at the distant city. It stretched out beneath him, vast and unbroken. He had won, they had all won, but at what cost? What was the point of all this if people couldn't feel anything? What was the point of freedom if it didn't come with the messy, painful, beautiful mess of human experience? Jace felt something stir in him then, a fleeting spark of something, distant, buried, but undeniable. He hadn't felt this in a long time. It was like the faintest glimmer of a memory, one just out of reach. A memory of laughter. A memory of love. He shook his head, as if trying to shake off the thought. It was useless to dwell on it. There was no going back. The soldiers had been engineered for a purpose. They had been designed to be better than human, to be stronger, faster, smarter, without the emotional baggage that slowed normal people down. But what had it gotten them? What had it gotten him? He turned away from the city, walking back inside, moving with the mechanical precision he'd long adopted. But something had shifted in him, something that gnawed at him like a hunger he didn't fully understand. The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and logistical discussions. The world was rebuilding, but the rebuild was cold. Efficient, but cold. Jace's soldiers moved through the motions, taking control of the major cities, instituting the new order. People were fed, clothed, housed, but there was no real sense of purpose. No sense of hope. Sloane came to him in the middle of another briefing. "We need to do something, Jace. We can't just keep going like this. It's not enough." "I know," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what else to do." Sloane stared at him, her eyes hard. "You're the one who led us here. You've got to figure out what we do next." "I don't even know what we are anymore," Jace replied, his voice low. "I thought victory meant something. I thought we were fighting for more than just survival." "And now?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Now? I don't know." He let out a frustrated sigh, slamming his fist onto the table in front of him. "Now, it feels like nothing." There was a long silence. Sloane didn't say anything for a while. She just watched him, her arms crossed, and for a moment, Jace felt like she was seeing through him, as if she understood him in a way no one else could. "You know," she said finally, "it's not just the soldiers. It's the whole damn world. We've created something that works, but it's hollow. We didn't just take down the corporation. We took down everything that made life worth living. All that passion, all that joy, that anger, it was part of what made us human. Now we're all just functional. No more spark." Jace looked at her, then let out a bitter laugh. We were supposed to fix the world. We were supposed to give people freedom. But now we've created a world that's efficient and logical, but it's dead. It's not just the world, Jace, Sloane said quietly. It's us. It's you. You've changed. We've all changed. Jace's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean that we're all the product of what we did. We thought we could win by taking away what made us weak. Emotions. We thought that if we could remove all of that, fear, anger, love, we'd be better. But look at us. We've become something else. We've become machines. Jace stood up suddenly, unable to stay still. He paced around the room, then stopped, turning to Sloane. I can't go back, Sloane. We can't go back. We did what we had to do. I know. She paused. But the question is, can we move forward? Can we live in this world we've created, or do we need to find a way to feel again? Jace didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out over the city. His city now. But what was it really? It felt empty. And for the first time, he couldn't help but wonder if they'd made a terrible mistake. In the following days, Jace sought answers in every corner of the city. He spoke to the surviving leaders of the old regime, to the people they had freed, to the scientists who had engineered the soldiers. But no one had an answer. The world was functioning, yes. But no one had a clue about how to feel again. No one knew how to return the spark that had been lost in the battle for control. Then, one night, Jace received an unexpected visitor. It was Dr. Ilara Miles, one of the lead scientists who had been responsible for creating the biochemical enhancements that had stripped them all of their emotions. She had come to offer him a choice. There's a way to restore it, she said, her voice cold but sincere. To give you back what you've lost. Jace looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. And what's the catch? The process isn't simple, Dr. Miles explained. It's experimental. It could destabilize everything we've worked for. You could risk chaos. But you could also bring back the emotions, the connection, that you've lost. You could make the world human again. Jace stood still for a long moment. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Restore emotions, and risk everything they had fought for, or live in this cold, efficient world that was missing the very thing that made them alive. But Jace knew, deep down, that there was only one choice. They had fought for something more than just survival. They had fought for the chance to feel, to experience the highs and lows of life. Without that, the revolution had meant nothing. I'll do it, he said, his voice resolute. Do it. Bring it back. Dr. Miles nodded, her expression unreadable. Are you sure? Because once you make this choice, there's no going back. Jace looked out at the city again, a world that had been stripped of everything but logic and order. I'm sure. It's time for us to live again. The decision felt final. Jace felt a strange mix of clarity and dread settle over him as he stood in the sterile room with Dr. Miles. She moved quickly, her hands steady as she prepared the equipment, her face expressionless, as if this were just another procedure, another task to be completed. But Jace could feel the weight of the moment, pressing on his chest like a physical burden. He had chosen this. He had chosen to feel again. To risk everything for the chance to reconnect with what it meant to be human. I need you to sit down, Dr. Miles instructed, her tone brisk that he obeyed without hesitation, settling onto the metal chair in the center of the room. The machinery hummed around them, sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything other than numb. Even now, as he prepared to undergo the procedure that would restore his emotions, there was a part of him that questioned it. What if it didn't work? What if the emotions were gone forever, unreachable, irrevocable, but there was no going back now? He had already made his choice. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Dr. Miles asked again, her gaze searching. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if she had some inkling of the weight of his decision. Jace nodded. Yes. She didn't speak again, just attached the electrodes to his scalp and arms, connecting him to the machines that would, she hoped, reverse the biochemical process that had altered his brain, that had wiped his emotions clean. The air seemed to thicken as the machines powered up, a low hum filling the room. The sound vibrated in his bones, a reminder of how much was at stake. Jace closed his eyes. He could almost feel the shift beginning, the stirring of something that had been dormant for so long. He was aware of every sensation, the subtle discomfort of the electrodes against his skin, the soft breeze from the ventilation system, the rhythmic hum of the machines. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent, something faint and fragile, like the brush of a distant memory. The machines clicked into motion, and a sharp electric jolt shot through his body. Jace gasped, his muscles tensing involuntarily as the current passed through him. His vision blurred for a moment, and then, a flood of images rushed to his mind, faces, places, moments he had long since buried under layers of detachment. His parents. A childhood friend laughing under the autumn sun. His first kiss. The night they'd won the revolution, when the fire in their hearts had burned brighter than any victory. He breathed deeply, fighting the waves of emotion that crashed over him, threatening to drown him. His chest tightened as he felt the weight of everything he had lost, and everything he had forgotten. I can feel it, he whispered, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been trapped inside him for years. Doctor Miles didn't respond, but he could hear the faint click of her fingers on the console, adjusting something, tuning the machines, as if she could sense the shift in him too. The floodgates had opened. Emotions poured through him in waves, raw and unfiltered. The grief. The joy. The anger. All of it. It was like stepping into a storm. It overwhelmed him, almost choking him, but it was real. It was alive. He gasped for breath, his chest heaving as his emotions fluctuated wildly, intense joy followed by crushing sadness, then flashes of anger, frustration, and even love. It was all there. Everything he had suppressed, everything he had been forced to ignore, it was rushing back into him with such force that it was hard to distinguish where one emotion ended and another began. But it wasn't just the personal memories that flooded him. He could feel the emotions of the world around him, the fears of the citizens they had freed, the pain of the soldiers who had fought, the joy of a people who had finally found a glimmer of hope. Everything that had been erased in their pursuit of efficiency, was coming back. It was beautiful and terrifying at once. The pain of it was sharp, like being caught in a wave you couldn't escape. But then, as quickly as it had come, the storm began to recede. The intensity started to settle, the rawness smoothing into something more familiar. He felt the sobs rack through his body, a strange catharsis, as though the floodgates had finally burst open and allowed him to release everything he'd held back. He wiped his face, the wetness of tears unexpected and almost foreign to him, but it felt right. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to cry until it was happening. The tears were a release, a sign that he was truly alive again. Dr. Miles stepped back, watching him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. Jace looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he truly saw her. Saw her as a person, with her own hopes and fears, her own experiences. She wasn't just a scientist anymore, she was a human being, a part of this fragile, complex world. "I feel everything," he said, his voice unsteady. It's all so much. But I feel alive." Finally. Dr. Miles nodded, as if she understood. She didn't speak again, but her expression softened, and for a moment, they just stood there together in the quiet aftermath of what had just happened. Jace left the laboratory feeling different. The world felt different. It was brighter, more intense. He could hear the sounds of the city in a way he hadn't before, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people on the streets, the rush of wind through the trees. It was all so alive, so full of possibility. He had been missing this. He had been missing life. As he walked through the corridors of the compound, he saw his soldiers moving with the same detached precision as before. But now, he could see it more clearly, the emptiness in their eyes. They didn't feel like he did. They were still trapped in the numbness that had been forced upon them. The rebellion had been won, yes, but what was left of their humanity? What was left of the thing that had driven them to fight in the first place? Jace stopped in front of a mirror in one of the hallways, his reflection staring back at him. He didn't recognize the man in the glass. His face had changed, softened in a way that was almost unsettling. The cold, hard edges of the past seemed to have melted away, and in their place was something raw, something human. He could feel his heart beating, could hear the rush of blood in his veins. He was alive, but was he alone? He turned and left the mirror behind, heading toward the war room. He had decisions to make. There was no time to waste. The restoration of emotion wasn't something he could keep to himself. If he was going to rebuild this world, if they were going to truly live again, it would require more than just himself. It would require all of them, his soldiers, his people. They had to feel again, too. The thought of facing his soldiers with this newfound awareness was both daunting and invigorating. What would they think? What would they say? Could they, too, experience what he had just felt? Could they rediscover the emotions that had once made them human? He didn't know, but he had to try. As he stepped into the command center, he saw Sloane standing by one of the windows, gazing out at the city. Her posture was rigid, as it always had been, but there was something different in the way she held herself now. She wasn't as detached as before. Jace could sense it. He walked over to her, the weight of everything he had just experienced pressing down on him. "Sloane," he said, his voice unsteady but determined. She turned, her eyes searching his face. "You're different," she said, the words spoken like an accusation. Jace nodded. "I am. We all are. But we have a choice, Sloane. We can live like we've been living, or we can choose to feel again." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in a long time, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope? Longing? He couldn't tell. But it was there. A spark. A reminder of what they had fought for. "We can't keep going like this," she said quietly. "I don't know how to feel, Jace. But I want to." "I know," he whispered. "I want to, too." He reached out to her, his hand trembling as he touched her arm. "Let's try. Together." And in that moment, Jace realized something that had been buried deep inside him for so long. The revolution hadn't ended with the fall of Omnicorp. It had only just begun.